Thank you. Thank you. Aw, shucks. So I'm just going to get right to it. We're going to be talking about gender equality in the secular movement. And rather than read long bios for everybody, I'm going to introduce myself briefly and let each panelist introduce themselves briefly, and then we're going to get into it. I'm Greta Christina. I write Greta Christina's blog. It's called that, in fact. I am the author of Why Are You Atheists So Angry? 99 Things That Piss Off the Godless. Aw, thank you. And more recently, I'm co-organizer and co-host in San Francisco of The Godless Perverts, which is a series of performance events and community social gatherings about atheism and sex and sexuality. So I'm going to now let our panelists introduce themselves.
I'm Stephanie Zvan. I blog at Almost Diamonds on the Free Thought Blogs Network. I am the associate president of Minnesota Atheists. I'm the host, one of the hosts of the Atheists Talk radio show. The other one's sitting right over there, so we're both here today. And in this crowd, I may actually be best known for, in the last year, having suggested that maybe our conferences should have anti-harassment policies.
I'm Ophelia Benson. I too blog at the Free Thought Blogs Network. My blog is Butterflies and Wheels. And I also, give it up. And I also edit a website by the same name, which is the parent of the blog. I write columns for Free Inquiry, The Freethinker, and the Philosopher's Magazine. And I'm co-author of Why Truth Matters and Does God Hate Women?
I'm Robin Elisabeth Cornwell. I'm the executive director of the Richard Dawkins Foundation here in the US. I am also an evolutionary psychologist, and on behalf of all the wonderful colleagues and scientists I work with who are women, I would like to suggest that it is not a pseudoscience.
My name is Debbie Goddard. I'm the director of outreach at CFI, so I oversee the campus and community programs. I'm also the director of African Americans for Humanism, which is a program headquartered there. For many years, thank you. For many years, I did the date stamp for Point of Inquiry, so for the fans in the audience, that's the thing that comes at the very beginning of the show. And I also blog too occasionally, but I still do put up about, at least a half dozen posts a year on Skepchick, too.
So we're talking today about gender equality in the secular movement, and I'm kind of going to assume that we're all on board with the idea that that's a good idea. And so I want to talk a little bit about, given that assumption, the first question I would like us to consider is, what does success look like? If we are, it's like we talk about, we want gender equality in the secular movement. Well, what does that mean? What are our goals? Is that numbers of women on the ground in our communities? Is that numbers of women in our leadership and visibility? Is it mean something other than just numbers? What do you think gender equality in the secular movement would look like? And I'm not going to assume that we all want the same thing, that we all want the same goals. So what are you guys' goals?
I do believe it means more than just numbers. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that when we have gender equality in this movement, we're going to be able to have a conference about our work and our goals and our concerns, and not have it start with a statement that says, those are all, really good things, but for the sake of humanity, don't take it too far. I'm going to say we have gender equality when we're allowed to be as cranky as the guys are. I'm going to say we'll have gender equality when we're allowed to screw up once in a while without it hanging over our heads for years and proving that other women are not fit to be leaders in this movement. I think gender equality, it's not a race to the bottom, but it means that we don't all have to be as exceptional as so many of the women that I meet here and that I really appreciate, but who can inspire so many more women to just get out there and work.
Well, to elaborate on Stephanie's theme to begin with, one thing that gender equality would look like would be to be able to have a conference like this and, as so many conferences do, have an official hashtag that refers to the conference without having it filled up with garbage posted there by people who hate the conference and everything it stands for. Another thing it would look like would just be not having to still be arguing about it, being able to take it for granted, being able to expect conferences to look pretty much quite similar to this one, and to be covering a lot of the same subjects with the same speakers and speakers like them, without it necessarily being called women in something. It would just be folded into the larger movement and belong there and be taken for granted as belonging there. And the issues that are being discussed being seen as completely central to the movement, or disappearing because they no longer are issues. You know, we would no longer have to battle religious discrimination against women because it would have, like the state under communism, it would have withered away.
I think in terms of equality, I would defer to how Martin Luther King put it, but extend it a bit, that we don't judge people by the color of their skin or their sex or their gender preferences, but we judge them by the content, their rationality, the way they behave in society, their actions in society, and how they try to help others. That is what I think we need to strive for in true equality, that it's not just women, it's all of us. And I suppose that's why I extend feminism to humanism, because I think it's all human beings that need this. And we heard earlier, you know, about the struggles of women in religion. And, you know, hearing their stories, it was quite moving. And bringing equality to them. And not just women are oppressed, but men are oppressed too by religion. We forget that. We talk about religion being a patriarchy, but men are just as trapped in the culture as women are in many ways. They can't just leave either. So we need to be, I think, to reach that equality, you know, there needs to be kindness and understanding. Yes, we need to get angry. We need to strive for it. I'm not asking us to give up. We need to speak out when we need to speak out, and we need to listen when we need to listen. And that's how we will reach, I think, the equality that we're looking for in this movement.
I don't know.
Good answer.
I was like, oh, crap. Maybe I'll listen to their answers and I'll be able to put one together by the time it reaches me. But, man, I've been asking other people this, too, this weekend. Like, what do you think gender equality would look like? What would success look like? Had some really great conversations and not one answer of what that would look like. It was easier to compare it to things like, you know, what would racial equality look like in our movement? I have no idea. Especially considering that there isn't gender equality in the general culture. You know, what, therefore, should we expect it to look like in our movement? There isn't racial equality, there isn't, you know, atheism and secularism isn't equally represented among the different racial demographics in the US. My statistics are US specific, I'll just mention that at the beginning. Because I know the situation is different in other countries. And so we shouldn't expect, say, equal representation from different racial groups in the atheist movement right now. We shouldn't, we realize that there are certain challenges that our movement isn't addressing that are important, more important to some of these racial demographics than the one that we tend to attract in our movement. And yet there are some issues, some identities that people use to characterize ourselves that aren't really an issue in the secular movement, like sexual orientation. You know, I haven't heard an atheist say like, you know, gay people, I'm not so sure. Or like same-sex marriage, nah, I don't really support that. If they support marriage in any sense, they're like, well, there should be equality there. It's basically not an issue for us. And if someone were saying like, you know, I'm an atheist, but I really don't think that queers should be getting married, we'd sort of shun them. We'd be like, yeah, that doesn't belong here. You probably don't have a good justification from a secular, reasonable, science-driven perspective, evidence-based perspective, to have that view, and you should learn more. So I guess maybe, so maybe what gender equality means is that we stop seeing these as like, you know, well, are these important issues to the secular movement that they're creeping in? Even if we don't have equal representation at our conferences, let's say, maybe we shouldn't expect that yet, because we know that women are more religious than men are in the general culture. But in our movement, it just seemed to be just integral to our identity and our beliefs, that, of course, women's issues are our issues, our secular issues, you know, that we work on them, that we believe that changes need to be made there. I guess that's the closest that I can come when I think about that, of what success might look like.
Well, I actually think it's interesting that none of you actually talked about numbers, except Debbie sort of touched on it very briefly. And I would actually like to ask you, do you think that the question of numbers, do we have equal representation, you know, roughly, you know, 50-50 in conferences and our organizations and our leadership and so on, or even representation that's reflective of the, you know, religious versus atheism balance in the culture in general? Do you think that's important? Do you think that that's a goal in itself? Do you think that that's maybe a marker of whether we're being successful? Is it perhaps a means to an end, or do you think it's not important at all?
I think it is a marker worth paying attention to, in part because even if we don't expect to see gender equity, like 50-50 gender equity, we expect to see, let's say, no conferences where no women are speaking, and that's something we still see. We should expect to see something at least close to the representation that we have in the broader community, depending on whether we're talking about secularism, where actually there is closer to 50-50 kind of, because you don't have to be an atheist to be interested in secular issues, and there are a number of religious people who are, particularly liberal religious people, where women are quite well represented. So I think we need to pay attention to it, but it's certainly not the be-all and end-all, and if we're not paying attention to other issues, you can't go after numbers in order to solve the problem. You have to also figure out what else is going on.
I think numbers are very useful as a sign, because people often say, you know, people have preferences, people have choices, people have likes and dislikes, and you can't just assume that women are always going to want to do exactly what men do, so that you're always going to find 50% represented in each profession, each vocation, each hobby, everything. That's true, but if there's a drastic imbalance, that is a sign, and it is a motivation to at least start digging deeper. And it's funny how whenever you do see that kind of huge discrepancy, and you do start digging deeper, and you do some research, and you do some studies, I'll be darned, it turns out it wasn't just pure preference after all. There was stuff going on that people hadn't noticed. There's a psychologist at the University of Washington, whom I've seen just because I watch local University of Washington TV, so I don't offhand know her name, but she does research on little tiny things in computer science labs at the University of Washington that turn out to change women's attitudes to the whole field. It turns out that just adding a plant will make a difference, and it's a good study, and it's genuine evidence. So there are all kinds of little there can be all kinds of little cues in the environment that nobody would notice. But when people do some digging, oh, gee, it turns out that this is just signaling women, this isn't for me. This isn't part of my world. Somehow I just don't feel right here. I'll go somewhere else. So yeah, it's true that we can't just decide ahead of time. Well, we have to have exactly proportional representation of women in all fields and all hobbies and politics and everything, absolutely every single thing. And it just has to come out right, or else, we'll call the cops. But if it's completely off balance, and then you look further and see that there are reasons, well, then you've done something useful.
Ophelia makes a really good point. The numbers are just indicators, and as anyone in the field of science and statistics, they don't provide the answer. You have to dig. That's what they allow you to do. That's why we love statistics. And then Debbie made the point, about women tending to be much more involved in religion than men, and much more, Pew studies and other studies consistently come out with this. And so understanding, those reasons and why the numbers tend to be skewed. I think the numbers, in the recent conferences, and I haven't been going to conferences maybe as long as you have, but about 10 years, I have definitely seen a shift, both in terms of women participation and also in terms of young people. There's been a tremendous shift. There are issues that face women that are very different, and also depending on race and their economic backgrounds and their religious upbringing, that men don't necessarily face the way women do. We are whether we like it or not, whether it's PC or not, we tend to be the ones that take care of family. We're the ones that bring family together, and I think, it's mentioned that, we are the caretakers. And because of that, those issues are not, I have seen that they've not been met. I think, I go around the country quite a bit, and in the last 2 years, I have had more and more people coming up to me and saying, we need to do more to help women and families. We need to do things that allow women to become more involved and to give up religion. And I've given talks on from an evolutionary psychological perspective of why women may tend to be more religious, and it's certainly not because they're less intelligent or less rational. It has to do with family and children. But, looking at that, we need to do whatever we can to give these opportunities for women to abandon religion, which we see in areas of the world that have very, very strong social support, government support. Religion pretty much goes away. We are a volunteer nation, and and churches and religious groups are the ones who tend to volunteer. So the culture that we're looking at is feeding into this. And we need to somehow put our heads together and figure out how we can provide the support that women are looking for in order to increase these numbers and allow them to give up that crutch, which is religion, which has oppressed them for so long, but at the same time offers benefits that we're simply not giving them.
I've forgotten the question.
The question is, do numbers matter? Do numbers matter? Do they matter as an end goal, as a means, as a marker, or do they not matter? Or some other whole answer, maybe.
I got this coffee this morning. There were some good points made here. I wanted to pull out a couple of them to highlight again, which is the word science was used, representation, things like that. Research, the plant thing, which I really want to look up. What plants made more women get involved in computer labs? That sounds crazy. But when they do studies, whatever we want the world to be like, we can research things and show what people are like. Our brains are dumb. They are so dumb. Their brains, we like to think they're smart, especially in this movement where like all of our decisions are rational ones, right? But they are not. I only used reason for my musical decisions. Of course, this is objectively better than that. And there's a lot of good stuff coming out of people with an interest in getting more women involved in STEM fields. And so scientists are studying why more women aren't involved in science, which is good, so they get good data. And they show, putting more pictures of women as scientists in science textbooks makes more women get involved. And I might think, I wish the world weren't like that, where that meant something to me. But the fact is, science shows us that means something to people. And so, yeah, it does mean something to people. If we have a conference somewhere, a local or regional event, you have more than 5 speakers, like, they should not all be men. That means something to people. We have a movement here. We're not just talking about an idealistic world. We're trying to change the world. We're trying to change culture. We're trying to change people. And so having a conference with 6 speakers and be like, we want to add another speaker. We have room for 6 on our schedule. Let's try to include a woman on our roster. Some people say, well, that means you don't get the best speakers at your event. Well, maybe it means you should be evaluating what fields you're drawing from and what best means to you and why you're using the criteria that you're using. Anyway, the point is, like, numbers matter. The faces we see when we walk into an event matter. Whether we want them to or not, they do. They inform whether or not we want to join that group, whether we see ourselves as a part of that group, whether we want to stay involved in that group. We don't just go to groups because we want to talk. We join them because we feel some connection to people, and in some way they're peers. There's some commonality of experience somewhere, right? So it does matter if there are people of color represented if I walk into a conference. If I'm under the age of 40 and everyone at the conference is over 65, and they're talking about their retirement communities, I might not be so interested. On the flip side, if someone who's over 65 goes to a meeting and it's all people in their early 20s talking about lol memes, you might not be like, and they stay up until 1:30 in the morning. They might be like, that's not really a group I want to join. So yeah, this stuff matters. The numbers do matter. The faces on our programs matter. The people who are able to be at events matter. Yeah, I'd say the numbers do matter.
So actually what you were just saying, Debbie, jumps to another question that I wanted to ask you, which has to do with my favorite 7-syllable word, intersectionality, which is when we're talking about gender equality in the secular movement, let's talk a little bit about not just the inclusion of women, but the inclusion of women of color, the inclusion of blue-collar women, the inclusion of trans women, the inclusion of not just not just college-educated, middle-class white women from the United States. I'm not sure if there's a question in there. Let's talk about that. And actually, there's a related question to that which is, as a movement, are we too U.S.-centered? Let's talk a little bit about internationality.
I just had a conversation yesterday with someone named Kirsty. I can't remember her name, but she's here with Veronica from Oslo. And the Norwegian Humanist Association is the largest humanist association in the world of a tiny country of 5 million people, which I like to point out to them is, 5/8 the size of New York City. But but the Norwegian Humanist Association has like over 80,000 members in it. And it has more women than men involved. She said probably a kind of slight majority, but still. And the things that they do are very different than what our atheist activists do and our atheist movement here does. A lot of it is providing certain levels of support, community organizing, they do baby naming ceremonies, or kind of christenings, but secular. They do confirmation ceremonies for 15-year-olds, and that's a huge, huge program there. And so they offer this kind of like family involvement support resources, and lots and lots of women are involved. I wonder if they have the conversation of like, how do we get more men involved in this movement? But it is different in other places depending on what the movement is. And my impression is the Humanist Society of Scotland, which is also hugely involved in the education system, and also they have a burgeoning secular wedding service there that lots and lots and lots of women are involved with that too.
Well, as Greta hinted, I do have a thing for internationalism, and I have done my best on my website and blog over the last 10 years, done my best to cover international stuff, especially for obvious reasons, people who speak English, and there are a lot of international people who speak English. And I think it's just wonderful that CFI invited Maryam Namazi to this. She's a hero of mine and has been for years. So, you know, one thing, if nothing else, one thing an event like this does is bring more of a spotlight to women's struggles all around the world, and the kind of work that people like Maryam do. Debbie mentioned the Norwegian Humanist Association. What she didn't mention is one reason they're so huge is that the government subsidizes them in the same way it subsidizes religion. Yep. And I met a few of them when I was in Stockholm very briefly for the launch of the Swedish translation of Does God Hate Women? And I met wonderful Swedish humanists who are of the sort of new atheist wing of Humanisterna, the Swedish humanists, and have had the same kind of quarrels with the less new atheist types in their organization. So I knew all the radicals. And they have a wonderful group, women's group, or a women's discussion group, but it also includes men that meets frequently, and they took me along to meeting that, and they were just the greatest people I'd ever met in my life. And one of them was Sarah Mohammed, who's from the Norwegian humanists. She lives in Norway, but she's sort of the Syrian version of Maryam. She's an ex-Muslim, radical, feminist, lesbian, just all the things you can think of. And she's a stalwart of the Norwegian humanists, and she's a fabulous woman. So one thing this focus on women in secularism can do is bring attention of privileged Americans like us to issues like that.
Talking a little bit about intersectionality, I think one of the challenges that we need to really wrap our heads around is that let's start talking about headscarves. When we talk about headscarves, there are a certain number of people who want to talk about women's choice to wear what they want. We shouldn't be telling women whether they want to wear that, whether they don't. But at the same time, we don't really manage to wrap our heads around the fact that we might have choices on our clothing, but if you live someplace where you will be potentially stoned, potentially shot, whipped, that's not a choice. Now we can, if we want to talk about that, and we want to talk about that in a way that does respect women's autonomy and women's choices about their clothing, what we actually need to do is find a way to demand meaningful choices for those people. And it's complex, but it's a sophistication that if we're not just going to talk about walking away from the Baptist church, we really, really need to wrap our heads around.
So I'm trying to make this really graceful transition to the next question, and I'm failing, so I'm going to make an awkward, clumsy transition to the next question. Because I want to get positive here for a minute. I want to talk about, at least I hope positive, what have we already accomplished? You know, we're talking about gender equality in the secular movement. Do you think we have moved towards that in the last year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, whatever? And if the answer is yes, if the answer is no, I want to hear that. If the answer is yes, what do you think we've been doing right? What do you think has been helping us move towards our goals?
I do think that we are seeing improvement, but we have seen it in the general population as well. I think we keep a little bit ahead of that. What are we doing right? I think that bringing young people into the movement and making it okay for women to be atheists, I think it's I really do think it's a greater stigmatism for women to be atheists than it is for men. And one of the interesting things I've found, and maybe there's somebody here who can give me a counterpoint, because so far I've asked at every conference and no one has ever given me a counterpoint. I know lots of men who are atheists who are married to religious wives, and of course they're religious women or partnered with religious women. But I have never met an atheist woman who's partnered with a religious man, except for now Teresa. So that's the first time. But that's kind of an exception too, because when you married, you were both religious. So I'm talking about people, women meeting, meeting and becoming involved with men who were religious, and most of the women I've spoken to, I haven't done a study on this yet. I would really like to, and I've talked to a couple of universities who are thinking about doing it. That there's kind of a more acceptance for men to be atheists, because in a lot of the feminist writings, and it's feminist writings I don't agree with, they talk about rationality being male and coming from the heart being female, that, emotions, and I'm actually going to talk about it a little bit tomorrow, but that fact that all things that are rational are considered much more male dominant, I find actually is very much an insult. Mm-hmm. But women are expected to think more irrationally, and are almost criticized for being very rational and very direct. I've had people tell me I'm kind of intimidating and scary, but I've always been a very direct person. I've managed departments, and you have to be direct. Mm-hmm. And I'm really not scary, honest. So, but it's interesting that part of our culture, and it's fed from both men and women. I mean, we're both guilty of this. I mean, culture doesn't, it's, the hand that rocks the cradle. Women pass this down. I'm sure, I don't know about you, Ophelia, but my mother, certainly passed down that, I was expected to be a mother and a wife first, obviously. Wife, mother, and if I couldn't do that, I was to be a librarian or a nurse or secretary, something, right? And that was, girls aren't good at math, girls shouldn't be scientists. I was discouraged from science, which is why I went back and did my degree later. So that you were talking about the plant in the office and things like that, and encouraging women to go into science. When you see T-shirts that say, I think it was J.C. Penney, that I'm a girl, I don't have to be good at math or something, right, absolutely ridiculous. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that with feminism, the first wave, the New York Seneca, we had women who were well educated, and we're talking about, getting back to, how do we expand this to blue-collar women? How do we expand it to women of color? How do we expand it to women of poor economic conditions? And we need to let women know that they can be rational, that it's allowed, and to please do it.
So other people, again, what have we, assuming, have we made progress, and if so, what do you think we've done to make that progress? What has been helping?
I was going to go on from what Robin said.
Oh, okay. I do want to get back to the positive stuff, but go ahead.
Okay. I was going to say, you could almost say doing the kind of thing you're talking about can be seen as more of a guy thing. In joke? Anybody get it? I've been talking about this for some while, and I've also been getting in some trouble for talking about it. But in fact, the talk I gave at this event last year was about this, was about the fact that atheism to some extent is seen as a guy thing because it's a fight with God. And when you're going to have a fight with God, you don't want to send a woman in because God is the ultimate man. And God is big and strong, and women are not seen as big and strong enough, or aggressive enough, or angry enough, or articulate enough, or rational enough, or belligerent enough, pugnacious enough, even dedicated enough, motivated enough to take on that battle. And this is a very deep stereotype, an implicit association, as Robin was talking about before. This isn't something we want to think, but it's there, and we're born into it. And Debbie was saying the same thing. We don't want to think that, but it's in there. So yeah, there is this very strong, not necessarily conscious, built-in thing that atheism is more of a guy thing, and therefore less of a woman thing. And that's the kind of thing you can whittle away at by doing things like this, and by having audiences like this, gatherings like this, and like the one at American Atheists last month, where we looked out at a sea of people, and it did not look dominantly male. And the more you do that, the more you chip away at these buried ideas of, well, atheism, that's not really something women are supposed to be doing.
So to get back to Greta's question, I do think we have made quite a bit of progress, even just in the last year, but certainly in the last 5. As for things that we're doing right, we're complaining. And, Bernice Sandler was here last year, and if you haven't seen her talk, I strongly recommend it. One of the things that she pointed out is that there are situations in which women are treated unequally to men, and if you point that out, people will say, no, that doesn't happen. But it gets better anyway, because you've pointed it out. So doing that is really important, and continuing to do that is really important, and understanding that a lot of what people are telling you in return isn't actually the result. It's the immediate response, but that's not the result of you complaining. We have done a good bit, actually Melody mentioned it in her speech. We've done a good bit of reaching out to atheist women wherever they are, women who are not in the movement, but who are and have been for years or decades doing an amazing job of speaking from an atheist perspective, frequently in feminism, but in lots of various kinds of academia. We have been promoting each other. We've been saying, hey, look, this person over there, they're doing a great thing. More of us have been volunteering, which means that when somebody decides to throw a conference or invite somebody to write something, anything like that, there's a woman sitting there on that board going, how about this person? So we're making a difference. We are. And we're doing it in ways that are probably obnoxious. That's okay. It works, right? So, yeah. I think we are making progress, and we're doing it by frequently doing the things we're told not to do.
Mm.
I wanted to add one thing on one of the things that we did wrong, and I'm going to take responsibility for this because I had set it up. How many of you are familiar with the Four Horsemen DVD, right?
Sure.
I mean, when that conference took place, Ayaan Hirsi Ali was there, and we had asked her to participate, but because of political issues in her homeland, she had to leave. And most people don't know that, and of course we always got criticized, why didn't you invite a woman? Well, we did. It was supposed to be 5, and it would never have been called, obviously, the Four Horsemen. It just, that came up after she had to regrettably leave and not be part of that. We're hoping to do something similar and see if we can get, Ayaan and maybe another woman to complete that series. I mean, we do invite a lot of women speakers, but it is unfortunate that Four Horsemen DVD, didn't include Ayaan because of circumstances. Because I think it may have made a difference in helping to promote that there are women who are very strong advocates of atheism. And again, it was just an unfortunate circumstance, and I wish, it had been so much different, but There we go.
Yeah,
Well, she wasn't there at the conference. So it was an opportune moment in DC here in this town. So it just went that way.
So Debbie, thoughts on this? You know, are we doing good, and if so, what are we doing right?
So, yes. Next, yeah. Let's take one example. The Amazing Meeting. Ignoring last year's statistics for the reasons that those happened, but the previous year, they had, and I actually don't remember what the speaker division was last year regarding men and women, but I know several years ago, there was something like 2 women on the schedule, maybe, and dozens of guys. And people complained, and they raised a fuss, and I think like 2 years after that, they had 50% women speakers at the conference, and that made a big difference. I think one shift I've seen in the 13 years I've been involved in this movement is that instead of just, and this accounts for the atheist movement side of things and the skeptic movement side of things, because there is a lot of overlap, but it's still the case that in the past we drew mostly from best-selling authors, scientists, and professors from fields that would talk about things like atheism. So a lot of philosophers, of course, and then some other fields, sometimes psychology and whatnot. And, you know, I remember reading a book by Neil deGrasse Tyson where he said when he got his PhD in astrophysics, I think he was the 7th African-American or maybe 7th person of color in the US to get a PhD in astrophysics. So if you wanted to put together like an astrophysics conference and you only wanted to invite people with PhDs in astrophysics, you might have a really hard time getting a diverse roster of speakers. And the same, I think, is true, actually. We'll have a harder time in this movement if the people that we always want to feature are New York Times bestselling authors and people with PhDs in philosophy who write books about atheism and scientists from certain fields. One of the shifts that we've seen at conferences, at all the regional conferences that have been popping up, all the really successful student conferences that have been popping up, and also at the national level, is that we see more educators, organizers, activists, and bloggers. I know there's some derision out there sometimes that someone's just a blogger.
Hey, blogging's hard work.
Right, I know, right? Yeah, which is ridiculous to me because it doesn't mean that their contributions aren't valuable, and they often write more than people who write books.
Yeah, I was going to say, you write 1,000 words a day.
Yeah, right.
I don't. Yeah. Yeah. Really? What? I wrote more than that. I at least changed my Twitter description a few times, I'm sure. 22 women, 47 men at TAM last year?
And only 3 people of color.
That sounds about right. Yeah. So as we see the movement shifting, what the idea of the movement is, who we have at conferences, who we are putting on pedestals and saying, this is a person worth listening to. When we see more activists, when we see more organizers and educators and bloggers and writers and people who are really involved, people who are the thought leaders of our movement, who are shaping the culture, we see more women. That's been a big shift in the last 10 years, and it's a shift that some people are still very resistant to. You know, they don't think that these people bring the academic credentials that maybe we should be featuring, but that's not true. That's not what the movement is necessarily. So yeah, there's been change there. Now some other people say, well, look at the student movement, assuming, I guess, that the student movement has a lot more women involved, a lot more girls, well, young women, and then we have high school people too. Having gone to a bunch of student conferences, both for SSA and for CFI on campus, I can say that's actually not as true as I want it to be. We still see maybe 33% women. We see more women in leadership positions in groups than we did 10 years ago, certainly. We don't see that many people of color involved. But yes, we do see a lot more young people involved, and I think that'll shift, especially as we diversify the sorts of issues we address. But there's still a long way to go.
So actually something that both Debbie and Robin touched on, which is this idea of going out of our way, you know, to be more inclusive, going out of our way to say, you know, gee, we keep inviting, you know, men over and over again to speak, whatever. So my two-part question, I guess. First of all, so basically we're talking about affirmative action. We're talking about making a conscious effort to, to be more representative, to be more diverse. First of all, does that work? And the second part of the question is a lot of times there's pushback against that it's like a quota and that it lowers our standards. I won't express my own opinion about it because I'm moderating the panel, but can you speak to that? First of all, does affirmative action work? And can you speak to this idea that somehow going out of our way to be more diverse lowers our standards?
So, plug. Minnesota Atheists are putting on a convention in Minneapolis this August 11th. I'm on the conference committee. We almost ended up with a full roster of female speakers completely by accident. We decided that if we were going to do that, we wanted to do that very consciously. And also, we really, really like Hector Avalos, so it didn't quite happen. But yeah, it works. Number of these people are people who weren't necessarily, well, and now I'm reaching actually into our workshops, are people who weren't necessarily speaking all that long ago. And who, if they were, maybe our board hadn't heard of them because they, spoke once at a regional convention someplace and nobody from our group went to it. So the fact that people are making an effort to get speakers out there, to get new speakers out there, whether they be specifically female, specifically people of color, specifically young speakers, it makes a difference even when that's not what you're trying to do.
Yes, it works. And one reason it works is that there's a repetition thing that gets going when you invite people. You invite star X, star Y, star Z, and so the next group of people that's putting on a conference goes, well, who should we invite? Oh, I know, X, Y, and Z, because, those are the people you always see. There's a hilarious novel, I think it's Michael Frayn's first novel, written back in the 60s, about a bunch of journalists, and there's this one sort of dweeby, ordinary guy who is asked to comment on racial issues because he has a mixed-race family living next door to him in the suburbs of London. And he goes on TV and he makes a complete fool of himself. At one point, he has a cigarette going and he lights another one to seem even more suave and doesn't realize he already has one going until he looks down at it. It's a disaster, and yet, as soon as it's over, people start inviting him, and he becomes a talking head because he was on once. So that happens with conferences. You see the same people, and they because they've been doing it, they've done it before, they seem like the right people to ask. And then they do it again, so they seem even more the right people to ask. So after a while, you start getting people invited who have already done it 50 times, and you never get people who haven't done it at all yet. So yeah, affirmative action works, even if only in the sense of, well, at least getting a few new people onto this list so that they too can light 2 cigarettes at once and make fools of themselves, and then get onto the list and get invited again.
Okay, so I'm going to speak somewhat from experience, and I happen to work with two people who are male and are very popular speakers. I won't go into detail about them. And I get lots of requests. That's where all the requests from. And Dave Silverman, please don't say anything. So, these conferences, people want to make money. I mean, as we heard from Melody, this conference is not going to be it's struggling to meet its financial obligations. And so what I hear from people who are putting together conferences is, oh God, please, can Richard come? It would make everything work. We will get people to attend. So, that's a real issue. That's an absolute issue that cannot be ignored. And I don't know how we get around that other than having, as women speakers come up through the ranks. I mean, Richard's been around for a long time. I mean, he has earned his reputation as a speaker and a philosopher and a scientist. So, we have to give him a little bit of credit for that. for being a new atheist at the age of 70, which I always find rather amusing. So, you know, this is part of the problem. And Debbie mentioned this, you know, as the base expands, and this is what has happened in every field where women have broken into it. It takes a while. I am so grateful to the women who went before me and were, can I use a bad word? Were bitches. Because I didn't then have to really be one. And I appreciate that. But they led the way. And then I hopefully mentored women who came after me. And I always try to mentor women to help them in their careers and to, you know, both when I worked in the semiconductor field and then in academics. And so that's one of the things we need to do too, is mentor women to bring them in and get them to speak. And women tend to be, the data show, women tend to be less, you know, willing to ask the questions, which is sometimes actually appreciated because people go on, but also, they're sometimes less willing to stand up and give talks. They may not feel comfortable, but they learn to feel comfortable, and it takes mentoring. And this is really important. But, you know, still, I think, you know, to get the affirmative action thing is really important. Mm-hmm. But we also have to know it's going to take time. Mm-hmm. And we do have some very, I mean, you know, Rebecca Goldstein and Susan Jacoby and Jennifer Michael Heck do somewhere. You know, these are very strong women who speak and can draw people. But, you know, we still need to lift them up as well, and I think, you know, we're doing that.
Debbie?
All right, so the question is,
affirmative action, does it work, and can you speak to the idea that somehow affirmative action means either quotas or lowering our standards?
Yes, it works. God damn it. It works! But I guess part of what the question is how do we measure if it works? You know, I'm an organizer, and a lot of it is just doesn't make me feel good if we do this, but do we see a change in how things are operating? If one of our goals is to broaden the movement, to expand the movement, to get more people involved, we can reach out to other kinds of people than the 20 we draw to our monthly meetings, right? And so what does affirmative action mean? It means saying, like, you know, there are some demographics that are not so represented. Let's do something that might be more appealing to them. And some people are like, you know, well, that's not good, because then I don't like to see race or sex. And so I don't even know, like, is there a problem? I can't see it. And then how do we reach out? Like, why isn't our group growing? Because you've already reached all the people in your circle who want to come to your group meeting, and no one's reaching out to different communities. So yeah, how do you reach out to different communities? And even, like, people don't even think about it. We don't think about the communities and the individuals that we have no contact with. Why would we? So even recently in Minnesota, I gave a talk on diversity at the University of Minnesota, and it was great. It was pretty well attended. I think about 60 people showed up. And one of the people said, like, oh, why weren't there more black students here? And I was like, well, did you talk to the Black Students Union? Like, oh, that would have been a thing we could have done, you know? And yeah, that was like in the list of recommendations I gave, but no one there already had contacts to that group. They weren't working with them. I said, well, this would have been a perfect opportunity for you to have done so, but even without that, you should just talk to them and be like, hey, we might have some overlapping issues, or why don't you come speak to us, or we'll send a speaker to your group, and let's talk about that. We want to grow. We're a movement. Again, like I keep stressing it, we're a movement. We know that we can do better and reach more groups if we think about groups to reach out to, and that might be LGBT groups that we're aligned with. That might be, you know, a few years ago, we weren't tabling at science fiction and fantasy conventions. In the last 6 years, we've seen an explosion of interest in new people getting involved because we're tabling at science fiction and fantasy conventions. because people there's a big overlap, right? You nerds. So we're at Dragon Con now. We're getting into smaller regional science fiction and fantasy conventions. That's kind of affirmative action. But some of it, people think it's not just like, well, let's find more nerds like me who can come to group meetings. It's let's find the people that aren't so like me or like the other people in this group whose issues I might not be so aware of, and maybe I don't think that they're important. And that's where the resistance comes in. Like, that's mission drift. That's not part of our movement. That makes me uncomfortable. I don't know anything about that. I can't talk about that. And I hear that a lot, you know, especially as director of African Americans for Humanism, as someone who goes to conferences and is involved in efforts like this, and as a conference planner when we talk about the speakers to invite. But it makes a difference. It makes a difference to reach out to these communities. They realize, I think, when they're not a part of this stuff, when they're not invited to be a part of it. And again, if we want to change things, we need to do this kind of outreach. If you want to sell a product that's now marketing really well to 45 to 65-year-olds, and you're like, you know, we could do better marketing to teenagers or to 18 to 24-year-olds, you know, you start looking like Mountain Dew commercials at some point, because that works. You shift your message a little bit, new people come in. So yeah, it does work. I've seen it work. By the way, one group that I left out before when I was talking about people that we've been inviting to conferences more lately, to see a shift in the gender represented on stages at conferences. I mentioned the educators and activists. I left out artists. We've seen more people involved in art, talking about science and art, talking about using art as a way to do outreach, to educate people. You know, there's been a huge growth of web comics that promote science. Certainly people involved in our conferences, we're reaching out more to certain artistic communities. That's also been, I think, a shift from how things were 10, 15, probably longer ago than that, years ago. That's made a difference.
So I want to comment briefly. I'm trying to not insert myself too much here, but I want to comment briefly and then go back to questions on something Debbie said about going out of your way to reach out and to just ask people. And this is something that I don't know who is at the American Atheists 50th anniversary American Atheist Conference in Austin. Did anybody else notice a dramatic increase in participation by African Americans at that conference over any other freaking conference other than ones that are specifically about African Americans? So Amanda Conf was on a panel, I think. Amanda Conf from American Atheists was on a panel, and I know, right? Amanda rocks. And she was talking about this, and so basically she was saying somebody asked her, how did that happen? You know, it's like, why are there so many tables? Why are there so many organizations? And she said, we asked them. So I have one more question of my own, and then we're gonna move on to some conference questions, which is, what are the consequences of unequal representation? What are the consequences if we don't have gender equality? And if we don't move in that direction?
So some of us have been living through those. Some of the consequences that we've seen. There are an awful lot of people who do believe in basic gender equality. But when you're not numerically represented well, when you're just one of, one woman or one of 2 or 3 women in a very large group of guys, and somebody comes up and says, hey, did you come here with your boyfriend? Or they say, women can't think. Or they say, hey, that guy over there, the one who is the president and actually said something that and agreed with you about something, he's just doing that because you're sleeping with him. You get those messages and you look around and there's nobody else to share them with. Guys don't necessarily see those things when they happen, even if they're happening in front of them. One of the things about this last year that has been amazing is that they have come out to the point where guys have to see them. And women have spoken up and said much more frequently, yeah, they were a jerk to me too. So being alone, being in a small group, being underrepresented makes a very large difference when you run into those relatively rare individuals who are just complete jerks based on your gender. When you have a group like this, where I'm looking out here, I'm thinking probably about 60-40, women to men. I don't feel alone here. I'm not gonna feel alone here. I know that there are enough women here that if I say something, a bunch of them are gonna go, yep. And they're gonna have my back. And that allows me to do things like take more risks, to say, voice my opinion. It allows me to step up into more of a leadership role and know that I'm gonna get support, at least for the good ideas. And that makes a huge difference. There are studies talking about, and I am not as familiar with them as I should be to talk about them up here, but there are studies talking about a kind of a tipping point. You know, what kind of percentage of female representation you need to have in a group for those kinds of things to stop happening or to stop being so intimidating. And, you know, there are a lot of strong women here, but we shouldn't all have to be that strong. So when we get good gender representation, we all are just that much more supported, and that makes a big difference.
Okay, I'm going to be Debbie Downer here.
What?
Because it's true what Stephanie said. That is one of the consequences. But what I see with this going on, and I think this is something you can generalize about. It happens with other kinds of outreach and affirmative action and growing numbers too, is yes, if there are more of us, we can support each other. But at the same time, when there are more of us, we start to piss more people off. And this rise in the curve of us being represented becomes visible to people, and the people to whom it's visible start reacting. And I think it's a python. I think it's a python with an undigested meal. I think there's a steep curve up at the beginning, and we're on that steep curve now. And I'm a W upper in the sense that I think it's going to level off and then go down again. But for now, I think we're on the upward slope. And so I think we have to face the fact that because we're having some success, because we're having a lot of success, we're also going to have to be putting up with quite a lot of shit for a fairly long time. And I would love to be able to say, well, by this time next year it'll all be over, but I'm not confident of that. So I think we need to be aware of that going in so that we're not shocked and surprised. I get a lot of mail and a lot of comments from people, from women, who tell me, thank God you keep talking, because if you didn't, I would get out. So, on the one hand, it's worth being aware of it so that you're braced for it, but at the same time, it's worth being aware that you're needed to be there in the way that Stephanie says for other people. But be aware that it's going to happen, but also be aware that you're not backing down in the face of it is going to be helpful to other women, and eventually it will snowball and it'll level off and the curve will go down.
Backlash doesn't happen. Backlash happens when you're making progress. Backlash doesn't happen when you're nowhere.
Right.
I'll be real quick on this one. If we don't reach equality, we lose. We lose, our children lose, our grandchildren lose, and so on.
I was kind of scared of being on this panel because I was like, what? What are we going to be talking about? This is like the whole theme of everything we're talking about here, and there's so much, and I don't, it was so broad a topic that I didn't know if I'd have stuff to say. And now I'm like, God damn it, I should have said all these things. I wish I had half an hour to respond to each one of these questions. There's so much to say. I wish I had said that. I was just like, I should have said this one thing about affirmative action. Oh, but it takes so much time. Maybe I should make videos or something. And then I keep forgetting the question because I'm like, what Ophelia just said, and I write it down.
What are the consequences of unequal representation
All right, so
and gender inequality?
The talk Jamila referenced, I did about diversity that has Lego blocks in it, talks about why our movement should be concerned about diversity, and that doesn't just mean having more black people show up. I know it's the first thing our brains go to often when they say diversity, but that's not what it means. I grew up in Philadelphia. When I moved to the suburbs when I was 16, it was like shock, like culture shock. Like, what? You people have never taken public transportation before? What is wrong with you? That was a big shock that I didn't know. I didn't know what it was like to live in the suburbs until I lived in the suburbs, really. And I could have talked to people about the experience of living in the suburbs, but living there really made a difference. They don't know what it was like to grow up in the neighborhood I grew up in Philadelphia, but when I talk to someone who grew up in a kind of similar neighborhood in Brooklyn or Chicago or something, or DC, they're like, yeah, that too. Yeah, I remember there was a shooting at the bottom of my street, and I remember when the school had this, and our local school had metal detectors, and what that's like. They don't know that. A lot of people don't know that unless they live through it or have people related to them who live through it. So one of the benefits of having a lot of different kinds of people in our movement is that we learn things that we didn't know before, and this is a movement that really likes learning things that we didn't know before. That we like collecting knowledge. It informs our ability to do creative or critical thinking about stuff, right? If we lack knowledge, we're just basing it on our own experience. We're universalizing our experience. We can't think well about stuff. So that's an important part. Like, I came from a Catholic and Jewish background. When I first talked to former Mormons, which was relatively recently in my life, I was just like, what in the hell? Really? You must be kidding me. And again, like growing up in a city where there are lots of religions, like sure, there are people who are super Catholic, but they're quite aware that there are other religious groups out there. For a Mormon in Utah, or northern Arizona or something like that, it can be a very different world. And then that's just talking about the US, Moving to Buffalo, I learned a lot about Canadian perspectives on things, which I never even thought about before, because Canada, what? That's far
just like
away and small.
Yeah, it's just like this giant state of the, right? Yeah,
I barely knew anything about them. And, I have conversations and I have questions. And so part of what I wanted to say is a defense of the idea of shut up and listen, please. There are times when you don't know something that someone else has experienced and that they can have shared experiences with other people. And so, and so saying that some of that is like, well, we can talk about this reasonably, that first, information has to be communicated. This is what it's like growing up as this kind of person in this kind of area. Like for me, growing up as like 5'10", 300-pound 18-year-old, let's say, I didn't get catcalled on the street. And when I learned that some of my friends who were 5'2" and 104 pounds and blonde and blue-eyed and whatnot, like were getting catcalled, I was like, what? And they're like, what, aren't you scared to walk around downtown at the street festival by yourself? And I was like, why would I be scared? Like, I don't carry a lot of cash. If they mug me, I'll just be like, here's my wallet. I'm sorry, can I keep my ID? But they're like, no, aren't you afraid of being assaulted? And I was like, what? No, I usually get like, excuse me, sir, pardon me. Like, that's outside of my experience. So no, like, tell me about that. How often does that happen? Let me find out. I remember talking at the conference last year to Sarah Moglia, who was on the panel yesterday, and she was saying about how when she tables for the Secular Student Alliance, like, guys come up to her and they're just absolute creepers sometimes. They're like, come back to my hotel room, they make comments about her shape and whatever, and she said, every woman has this when they're tabling, and I was like, I don't know, that's never happened to me. Like, seriously, what? That's really strange to me. And so first I'm like, tell me what that's like. How often does that occur? Like, who comes up to you? Does every time? Is that when other people are with you? Please tell me about your experience. You have information I don't know of what it's like to be, a young smallish, perky individual, like at a table at a conference. I don't know anything about that. I need to listen to you so I can learn this information. And so when we have diverse people in our movement from different backgrounds, from different cities, from different countries, then we have this knowledge, we gain this information that we didn't have before, which is so important to our ability to think about something. Otherwise, we can't get outside of it. When I went to Norway, you mentioned how the Norwegian Humanist Association gets money from the country. And like, they were like, yeah, that's what secular means. We registered, we're functioning as a religion. There's kind of a competition, like the more members they have, the more money they get from the government. The government funds them all equally, and that's what secular means. And I was like, that's ridiculous. That's not secular. You should have a separation between church and state. And they're like, well, why? You know, it's providing all this service to people. It's just not a big deal. And I talked to people from Belgium who felt similarly, and they're just like, yeah, why do you put the secular on humanism in America? And I was like, it's really important here because we have this church-state separation thing and we have First Amendment. But I never thought about it from your perspective. I never knew that secular could mean this other thing, that when you're in France, when you're in Sweden, when you're in Norway, you might have these different ideas of all the concepts wrapped up in that word that I didn't even know of. I'm going on too long. The point is, yeah, without experience to diverse perspectives, we're ignorant. And that's in all kinds of diversity.